Section 20 of Astounding Stories of Super Science, July 1930. Chapter 12 of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. Recording by Tommy Howell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 12. It took Bell just 8 days to reach the Paraguay, and those 8 days were like an age-long nightmare of toil and discomfort, and more than a little danger. The launch was headed downstream, of course, and with the current behind it, it made good time. But the distances of Brazil are infinite, and the jungles of Brazil are malevolent. And the route down the Rio Lourenço was designed by the architect of hell. Raudales lay in wait to destroy the little boat. Insects swarmed about to destroy its voyagers. And the jungle loomed above them, passively malignant, and waited for them to die. And as if physical sufferings were not enough, Bell saw Paula wilt and grow pale. All the way down the river they passed little clearings at nearly equal distances, and men came trembling out of the little houses upon those fazendas and fawned upon the señor who was in the launch that had come from upriver, and so must be in the service of the master himself. The clearings and the tiny houses had been placed upon the river for the service of the terribly laboring boat gangs, who brought the heavier supplies up the river to the master's central depot. Men at these clearings had been enslaved and ordered to remain at their posts, serving all those upon the business of the master. They fawned abjectly upon Bell because he was of os gentes, and so presumably was empowered, as the master had empowered his more intelligent subjects, to exact the most degraded of submission from all beneath him in the horrible conspiracy. Once, indeed, Bell was humbly implored by a panic-stricken man to administer the grace of the master to a moody and irritable child of 12 or so. "She sees the red spot, señor. It is the first sign, and I have served the master faithfully." And Bell could do nothing. He went on savagely. And once he passed a gang of camaradas, laboring to get heavily loaded dugouts up a fiendish raudal. They had ropes out and were hauling at them from the bank, while some of their number were breast deep in the rushing water, pushing the dugouts against the stream. "They're headed for the plantation," said Bell grimly, "and they'll need the grace of the master by the time they get there. And it's abandoned. But if I tell them..." Men with no hope at all are not to be trusted. Not when they are mixtures of 3 or more races, white and black and red, and steeped in ignorance and superstition, and, moreover, long subject to such masters as these men had had. Bell had to think of Paula. He could have landed and haughtily ordered them to float or even carry the light boat to the calmer waters below. They would have obeyed and cringed before him, but he shot the rapids from above, with the little motor roaring past rocks and walls of jungle beside the foaming water at a speed that chilled his blood. Paula said nothing. She was white and listless. Bell himself was being preyed upon by a bitter blend of horror and a deep-seated rage that consumed him like a fever. He had had fever itself, of course. He was taking and forcing Paula to take 5 grains of quinine a day. It had been included amongst his stores as a matter of course by those who had loaded his boat. And with the fever working in his brain, he found himself holding long imaginary conversations in which one part of his brain reproached the other part for having destroyed the plantation of the master. The labors upon that plantation had been abandoned to the murder madness because of his deed. The caretakers of the tiny fazenda on the river bank were now ignored. Bell felt himself a murderer because he had caused the master's deputies to cast them off in a callous indifference to their inevitable fate. He suffered the tortures of the damned and grew morose and bitter, and could only escape that self-torture by coddling his hatred of Ribiera and the master. He imagined torments to be inflicted upon them which would adequately repay them for their crimes, and racked his feverish brain for memories of the appalling atrocities which can be committed upon the human body without destroying its capacity to suffer. It was not normal. It was not sane. But it filled Bell's mind and somehow kept him from suicide during the horrible passage of the river. He hardly dared speak to Paula. There was a time when he counted the days since he had been a guest at Ribiera's estate outside of Rio, and frenziedly persuaded himself that he saw red spots before his eyes and soon would have had the murder madness come upon him. And then he thought of the supplies in Ribiera's plane in which they had escaped from Rio. They had eaten that food. It was almost unconsciously then that he saw the narrow water on which the launch floated valiantly grow wider day by day. When at last it debouched suddenly into a vast stream whereon a clumsy steamer plied beneath a self-made cloud of smoke, he stared dully at it for minutes before he realized. "Paula," he said suddenly, and listened in amazement to his voice. It was hoarse and harsh and croaking. "Paula, we've made it. This must be the Paraguay." She roused herself and looked about like a person waking from a lethargic sleep. And then her lips quivered, and she tried to speak but could not, and tears fell silently from her eyes, and all at once she was sobbing bitterly. That sign of the terrific strain she had been under served more than anything else to jolt Bell out of his abnormal state of mind. He moved over to her and clumsily put his arm about her and comforted her as best he could, and she sat sobbing with her hand on his shoulder, gasping in a form of hysterical relief, until the engine behind them sputtered and coughed and died. When Bell looked, the last drop of gasoline was gone, but the motor had served its purpose. It had run manfully on an almost infinitesimal consumption of gasoline for 8 days. It had not missed an explosion save when its wiring was wetted by spray, and now... Bell hauled the engine inboard and got out the oars from under the seats. He got the little boat out to midstream, and they floated down until a village of squalid huts appeared on the eastern bank. He landed there, and with much bargaining and a haughty demeanor disposed of the boat to the skipper of the Batalao in exchange for passage downriver as far as Corumba. The rate was outrageously high, but he had little currency with him and dared go no farther on a vessel which carried a boat of the master's ownership conspicuously towed behind. At Corumba he purchased clothes less obvious of os gentes, both for himself and for Paula, and that same afternoon was able to arrange for their passage to Asunción as deck passengers on a river steamer going downstream. It was as two peasants, then, that they rowed in sweltering heat amid a swarming and odorous mass of fellow humanity downstream. But it was a curious relief in some ways. The people about them were gross and unwashed and stupid, but they were human. There was none of that diabolical feeling of terror all about. There were no strained, fear-haunted faces upon the deck reserved for deck passengers and other cattle. The talk was ungrammatical and literal and of the earth. The women were stolid-faced and reserved, but when the long rows of hammocks were slung out in the open air, in the casual fashion of sleeping arrangements in the back country of all South America, it was blessedly peaceful to realize that the folk who snored so lustily were merely human animals, it might be, with no thought above their farinha and viejos on the morrow, but human. And the second day they passed the old fort at Coimbra and went on. The passage into Paraguayan territory was signalized by an elaborate customs inspection, and 3 days later Asunción itself displayed its red-tiled roofs and adobe walls upon the shore. Bell had felt some confidence in his ability to pass muster with his Spanish, although his Portuguese was limited, and it was a shock when the captain of the steamer summoned him to his cabin with a gesture before the steamer docked. Bell left Paula among the other deck passengers and went with the peasant's air of suspicious humility into the captain's quarters. But the captain's pose of grandeur vanished at once when the door closed. "Senor," said the steamer captain humbly, "I have not spoken to you before. I knew you would not wish it. But tell me, senor, have you any news of what the master plans?" Bell's eyes flickered, at the same time that a cold apprehension filled him. "Why do you speak to me of the master?" he demanded sharply. The steamer captain stammered. The man was plainly frightened at Bell's tone. Bell relaxed, his flash of panic for Paula gone. "I know," said the captain imploringly, "that the great fazenda has been deserted. On my last trip down, Senor, I brought many of the high deputies who had been there. They warned me not to speak, Senor, but I saw that you were not what you seemed, and I thought you might be going about to see who obeyed the master's orders." Bell nodded. "That is my mission," he said curtly. "Do not speak of it further, not even to the deputy in Asunción." The captain stammered again. "But I must see the Senor Francia," he said humbly. "I report to him after every trip, and if he thought that I did not report all that I learn—" "It is my order," snapped Bell angrily. "If he approaches you, say that one who has orders from the master himself gave them to you, and do not speak of the destruction of the fazenda. I am searching especially for the man who caused it. And wait! I will take your name, and you shall give me, say, 1,000 pesos. I had need of money to bribe a fool I could not waste time upon up country. It will be returned to you." And again the captain stammered, but Bell stared at him haughtily, and he knelt abjectly before the ship's safe. Asunción, as everybody knows, is a city of 60,000 people and the capital of a republic which enjoyed the rule of a family of hereditary dictators for 60 years, which rule ended in a war wherein 4/5 of the population was wiped out. And since that beginning it has averaged 8 revolutions to Mexico's 3, has had the joy of knowing 7 separate presidents in 5 years, none of them elected, and now boasts a population approximately 2/3 illegitimate and full of pride in its intellectual and artistic tastes. Bell and Paula made their way along the cobbled streets, away from the river, surrounded by other similarly peasant-seeming folk. Bell told her curtly what had happened with the steamer captain. "It's the devil," he said coldly, "because this whole republic is under the master's thumb. Except among the peasants, we can count on nearly everybody being on the lookout for us, if they so much as suspect we're alive. And they may, because I burned their damned fazenda, so—" Paula smiled at him rather wanly. "What are we going to do, Charles?" "Get a boat," said Bell curtly. "One with 3 or 4 men if I can. If I can buy it with the skipper's money, I will. But I can't take you to go bargaining. It would look suspicious." They had reached the central plaza of the town. The market swarmed with brown-skinned folk and seemed to overflow with fruits. A man was unconcernedly shoveling oranges out of a cart with a shovel, as if they had been so much coal. A market woman so unconcernedly dropped some of the same golden fruit within a small pen, where a piglet awaited a purchaser. To the left there were rows of unshaded stalls, where the infinitely delicate handmade Paraguayan lace was exposed for sale. "I think," said Paula, "I think I will go in the cathedral. I will be very devout, Charles, and you will find me there when you return. I will be safe there, certainly." He walked with her across the crowded plaza. He should have known that your peasant does not stride with head up, but regarding the ground. That a man who works heavily droops his shoulders with weariness at the end of a day. And especially he should have realized that Paraguay is not, strictly speaking, a Latin American nation. It is Latin Indian, in which the population graduates very definitely from a substratum of nearly or quite pure Indian race to an aristocracy of nearly or quite pure Spanish descent, and that the color of a man's skin fixes his place in society. Both Bell and Paula were too light of skin for the peasants' clothes they wore. They aroused curiosity at once. If it was not an active curiosity, it was nevertheless curiosity of a sort. But Bell left her in the shadowy, cool interior of the cathedral, which seems so pitifully small to be the center of religion for a nation. He saw her move toward one of the little candlelit niches in the wall and fall quite simply on her knees there. And he moved off to wander aimlessly down the river shore and stare about and presently begin a desultory conversation with sleepy boatmen. It was 3 hours and more before he returned to the cathedral, and Paula was talking to someone. More, talking to a woman in the most discreet of mantillaed church-going costumes. Paula saw him in the doorway and uttered a little cry of relief. She came hurrying to him. "Charles, I have found a friend. Isabella Ibarra. We were schoolmates in the United States, and she has just come back from Paris. So you see, she cannot... I see, said Belle very quietly. Paula was speaking swiftly and very softly. We went to school together, Charles. I trust her. You must trust her also. There is no danger this time. Isabella has never even heard of the master. So you see... I see that you need someone you can trust, said Belle grimly. I found that the captain of the steamer had gone to the master's deputy here. While I was talking to some boatmen, a warning was given to look out for a man and a woman together who may try to buy a boat. We're described, and only the fact that I was alone kept me from being suspected. Police, soldiers, everybody is looking out for us. Paraguay's under the master's thumb more completely than any other nation on the continent. The figure to which Paula had been talking was moving slowly toward them. A smiling, brown-eyed face twinkled at them. You must be Charles, said a warm and clucking voice. Paula has raved, senor. Now I'm going to take her off in my carriage. She is my maid, and you will follow the carriage on foot, and I will have the major domo let you in the servants' entrance, and the three of us will conspire. It was incongruous to hear the English of a girl's finishing school from the mantilla'd young woman who beamed mischievously at him. She had the delighted air of one aiding a romance. It was doubly incongruous because of the dark and shadowy cathedral in which they were, and the raucous noises of the market in the plaza without. Belle had a sense of utter unreality as Isabella's good-humored voice went on. Do you remember, Paula, the time the French teacher caught us in the pantry? I shall feel just like that time. This is dangerous, said Belle steadily, and it is very serious indeed. Pooh, said Isabella comfortably. Paula, you didn't even know I was married. A whole year and a half, and he's a darling, really. I'm the Senora Isabella Ibarra de Zuloaga, if you please. Bow gracefully. She chuckled. Jaime came all the way to Rio to meet me last month. I'm wild about him, Paula. But come now. Follow me humbly, like a nice little mestizo girl who wants to be my maid, and I'll let you ride with the cochero, and Charles shall follow behind us. She swept out of the cathedral with the air of a grand dame, suppressing a giggle, and Paula went humbly behind her. And Belle trudged through the dust and the blistering sun while the highly polished carriage jolted over cobblestones, and the youthful Senora Isabella Ibarra de Zuloaga beamed blissfully at the universe which did not realize she was a conspirator, and Paula sat modestly beside the brown-skinned cochero. It was not a long ride nor a long walk, though the sun was insufferable. The capital of Paraguay is not large. It is a sleepy, somnolent little town in which the most pretentious building was begun as the presidential palace and wound up as the home of a bank. But there are bullet marks on the facade of the Museo Nacional, and there is still an empty pedestal here and there throughout the city where the heroes of last year's revolution in bronze have been pulled down, and the heroes of this year's uprising of the people have not yet been set up. Red-tiled roofs give the city color, and the varying shades of its populace give it variety. And the fact that below the wider class of inhabitants, Guarani, is spoken instead of Spanish, adds to the individuality of its effect. But the house into which the carriage turned could have been built in Rio or Buenos Aires without comment on its architecture. It had the outer bleakness of most private homes in South America, but it was huge, and its windows were barred. The patio into which Belle was ushered by a bewildered and suspicious major domo made up in color and in charm for all that the exterior lacked. A fountain played amid flowers and macaws and parrots, and myriad other caged birds hung in their cages about the colonnade around the court, and Belle found Paula being introduced to a pale young man in the stiff collar and unspeakably formal morning clothes of the South American who is of the upper class. Jaime, said Isabella, beaming, and this is Charles, whom Paula is to marry. It is romantic, it is fascinating, and I depend on you to give him clothes so that all our servants won't stare goggle-eyed at him. And I'm going to take Paula off at once and dress her. They are our guests. And Jaime, you must threaten all the servants terribly, so they will keep it very secret that we have two such terrible people with us." Paula smiled at Belle, and he saw that she felt utterly safe and wholly at peace. Something was hammering at Belle's brain, warning him, and he could not understand what it was. But he exchanged the decorous limp handshake, which is conventional south of Panama, and followed his unsmiling host to rooms where a servant laid out a bewildering assortment of garments. They were all rather formal, the sort of clothing that is held to be fitting for a man of position where Spanish is the official, if not the common tongue. His host retired without words, and Belle came out later to find him sipping moodily at a drink. He wiped his forehead. "Be seated, senor," he said heavily, "until the ladies join us." He wiped his forehead again and watched somberly while Belle poured out a drink. "Isabella," he seemed to find it difficult to speak. "She has told me a little, but there has been no time for more than a little. I do not wish to have her tell me too much. She does not understand. She was educated in North America, where customs are different. She demands that I assist you and the senorita." "It is the senorita." Belle stiffened. In all Spanish America, the conventions are strict. For a man and a woman to travel together, even perforce and for a short distance, automatically damns the woman. "Go on," said Belle grimly. His host was very pale indeed. "She demands that I assist you and the senorita to escape the police and the government, provided that you do not tell me who you are. I will attempt it. But I wonder," said Belle quietly, "if you have ever seen red spots dancing before your eyes." His host went utterly livid. Zuloaga looked down at his hands, as if expecting unguessable things of them, and then he shrugged and said harshly, "I have, senor. So you see that Isabella, who does not know, is asking me to risk not only my life, but her honor." Belle said nothing for a moment. He was a little pale. "And your honor?" he asked quietly. The pallor on the face of the Senor Jaime Zuloaga was horrible. He tried to speak, but could not. He stood up and managed to say, "So much I will risk, because you have been my guest. Until tomorrow morning, you are safe. Unless the Senor Francia has his spies within my own house, I will attempt even to procure a boat. But—" Something made Belle turn. The majordomo was moving quickly out of sight. Like a flash, Belle was upon him, and like a flash, a knife came out. Belle's host gasped. The fact that his servant had spied was more than obvious, and he had spoke treason against the master. He leaned against the table, sick and trembling and mumbling of despair, while there were crashes in the room into which Belle had plunged, while bodies thrashed about on the floor, and while stertorous breathing grew less and stopped. Belle came back, breathing hard. The front of his coat was slashed open. "He's dead," he said harshly. "He'd have reported what you said, so I killed him. And now we've got to do something with his body." He helped in the horrible task, while his host grew more and more shaken. No other servants came near, and Belle could almost read the thoughts that went through Zuloaga's brain. One servant had spied to report his treason, and that meant assassination for himself, as the least of punishments, and for his wife. But there would be no punishment if he went first to the deputy and said that Belle had killed the majordomo. Belle left the house before dark, desperately determined to steal a craft of some sort, return for Paula, and get away from Asuncion before dawn. He returned after an hour. In the morning, a man would be found bound and gagged, with 500 pesos stuffed into his pockets. His boat would have vanished. But there was a commotion before the house where Paula waited fearfully. A carriage stood there with a company of mounted soldiers about it. Someone was being put into it. As Belle broke into a run toward the house, the carriage started up and the soldiers trotted after it. Paula was taken. End of Chapter 12 of Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. Section 21. Astounding Stories of Super Science, Number 7, July 1930. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Howell. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. Chapter 13. That night, Bell turned burglar. To attempt a rescue of Paula was simply out of the question. He was entirely aware that he would be expected to do just such a thing, and that it would be adequately guarded against. Therefore, he prepared for a much more desperate enterprise by burglarizing a bookstore in the particularly neat method in which members of the trade are instructed. The method was invented by a member of the trade who was an ex-cabinet maker and who perished disreputably. He killed a certain courier of a certain foreign government, thereby preventing a minor war and irritating two governments excessively, and was hanged. The method, of course, is simplicity itself. One removes the small nails which hold the molding of a door panel in place. The molding comes out. So does the panel. One enters through the panel, commits one's burglary, and comes out, replacing the molding and the nails with reasonable care. Depending upon the care with which the replacing is done, the means of interest is more or less undiscoverable, but it is usually used when it is not intended that the burglary ever be discussed. Bell abstracted 2 books, wrapping paper and twine. He departed using great care. He walked 3 miles out of town and to the banks of the Paraguay. There he carefully saturated the pages of both books in water, carefully keeping the bindings from being wetted. Then he tore one book to pieces, saving the leaves and inserting them between the leaves of the other book. Then, with a Brazil nut candle for illumination, he began to write. You see, when 2 thoroughly wetted pieces of paper are placed one above the other with a hard surface, such as the cover of another book under them, you can write upon the top one with a stick. The writing will show dark against the gray of the saturated paper. You then remove the top sheet and end, the writing reproduced on the bottom sheet. And then you can dry the second sheet and find the marking vanished, until it is wetted again. It is, in fact, a method of watermarking paper. And it is the simplest of all methods of invisible writing. Bell wrote grimly for hours. The book he had chosen was an old one, an ancient copy of one of Lope de Vega's plays, and the pages were wrinkled and yellow from age alone. When by dawn the last page was dried out, there was no sign that anything other than antiquity had affected the paper. And Bell wrapped it carefully and addressed it to an elderly senora of literary tastes in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and enclosed an affectionate letter to his very dear aunt, and signed it with an entirely improbable name. It was mailed before sunrise, the necessary stamps having been filched from the burglarized bookstore, and the price thereof being carefully inserted in the till. Bell had made a complete and painstaking report of every fact he had himself come upon in the matter of the master and his slaves, and appended it to a copy of the report of the dead Secret Service operative number 114. And he destroyed that after copying it. He had concluded that since he had been given dismissal by Jameson in Rio, he considered himself at liberty to take whatever steps he saw fit. And since the Signorina Paula Canalejas had been kidnapped by agents of the master, he intended to take steps which might possibly bring about her safety, but would almost certainly cause his death. The report should be at least of assistance if the trade set to work to combat the master. Bell had no information whatever about that still mysterious and still more horrible person himself. But what he knew about the master's agents he sent to a lady in Puerto Rico who has an astonishingly large number of far-ranging nephews. And then Bell got himself adequately shaved, bought a hearty breakfast, and after 1 or 2 heartening drinks was driven grandly to the residence of the Senor Francia, deputy of the master for the Republic of Paraguay. The servants who admitted him gazed blankly when he gave his name. A door was hastily closed behind him. He was ushered into an elaborate reception room, and after an agitated pause, no less than 6 separate frock-coated persons appeared and pointed large revolvers at him, while a 7th searched him exhaustively. Bell submitted amusedly. "And now," he said dryly, "I suppose the Signor Francia will receive me." There was more agitation. The 6 men remained, with their weapons pointed at him. The 7th departed, and Bell redressed himself in a leisurely fashion. 10 minutes later, a slender, dark-skinned man with impeccably waxed mustaches entered, regarded Bell with an entirely impersonal interest, took one of the revolvers from one of the 6 frock-coated gentlemen, and seated himself comfortably. He waved his hand, and they filed uneasily from the room. So far, not one word had been spoken. Bell retrieved his cigarette case and lighted up with every appearance of ease. "I've come," he said, "to request that I be sent to the master. I believe that he is anxious to meet me." The dark eyes scrutinized him coldly. Then Francia smiled. "Pero si," he said negligently. "He is very anxious to see you. I suppose you know what fate awaits you." His smile was amiable and apparently quite friendly, but Bell shrugged. "I suppose," he said dryly. "He wants to converse with me. I have been his most successful opponent to date, I think." Francia smiled again. It was curious how his smile, which at first seemed so genuine and so friendly, became unspeakably unpleasant on its repetition. "Yes." Francia seemed to debate some matter of no great importance. "You have been very annoying, Senor Bell. The Senor Ribiera asked that you be sent to him. It was his intention to execute you privately. He described a rather amusing method to me, and I must confess that you have annoyed me likewise. Since the Cuyaba plantation was destroyed, my subjects have been much upset. They have been frightened and even stubborn. Only last week," he smiled pleasantly, and the effect was horrible, "only last week I desired the society of a lady who is my subject, and her husband considered that, since the fazenda was destroyed, the master would be powerless to extend his grace before long in any event. So he shot his wife and himself. It annoyed me enough to make me feel that it would be a pleasure to kill you." He raised the revolver meditatively. "Well?" said Bell coldly. Francia lowered the weapon and laughed. "Oh, I shall not do it. I think the master would be displeased. You seem to have the type of courage he most desires in his deputies. And it may yet be that I shall greet you as my fellow deputy, or perhaps my fellow viceroy. So I shall send you to him. I would say that you have about an even chance of dying very unpleasantly, or of being a deputy. Therefore I offer you such courtesies as I may." Bell puffed a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. "I'm about out of cigarettes," he said mildly. "They shall be supplied. And, if you would desire feminine society, I will have some of my pretty subjects." "No," said Bell bluntly. "I would like to speak to the Signorina Canalejas, though." Francia chuckled. "She left for Buenos Aires last night. The Senor Ribiera sent a most impatient message for her to be sent on at once. I regretted it, but he had the master's authority. I thought her charming myself." The skin about Bell's knuckles was white. His hands had clenched savagely. "In that event," he said coldly, "the only other courtesy I would ask is that of following her as soon as possible." Francia rose languidly. The revolver dangled by his side, but his grip upon it was firm. He smiled at Bell with the same effect of a horrible, ghastly geniality. "Within the hour, senor," he said urbanely. "With the guard I shall place over you, it is no harm, I am sure, to observe that the master is at his retreat in Punta Arenas. You will go there tomorrow, as I go tonight." He moved toward the door and smiled again, and added pleasantly, "The Signorina was delivered to the Senor Ribiera this morning." Matters moved swiftly after that. A servant brought cigarettes and a tray of liquors, which Bell did not touch. There was the sound of movement, the scurrying, furtive haste, which seems always to imply a desperate sort of fear. Bell waited in a desperate calmness while rage hammered at his temples. Then the clattering of horses' hooves outside. A carriage was being brought. Soldiers came in and a man beckoned curtly. Bell stuffed his pockets with smokes and followed languidly. He was realizing that there was little pretense of secrecy about the power of the master's deputy here, police and soldiers. But Paraguay, of all of the nations of the southern continent, has learned a certain calm realism about governmental matters. The man who has power is obeyed. The man who has not power is not obeyed. Titles are of little importance, though it is the custom for the man with the actual power eventually to assume the official rank of authority. Since the president in Asunción, it was no more than a figurehead who called anxiously upon the Señor Francia every morning for instructions concerning the management of the nation. Francia indifferently ignored him whenever he chose and gave orders directly. There would be very little surprise and no disorder whatever when the master proclaimed Paraguay a viceroyalty of his intended empire. The carriage went smartly through the cobbled streets with a cavalry escort all about it. An officer sat opposite Bell with his hand on his revolver. "I'm receiving at least the honors of royalty," Bell commented coldly to him in Spanish. "Senor," said the officer harshly, "this is the state in which the deputies of the master were escorted." He watched Bell heavily, but with the desperate intentness of a man who knows no excuses will be received if his prisoner escapes. Out of the town to a flying field where a multi-engined plane was warming up. It was one of the ships that had been at the master's fazenda of Cuyaba, one of the ships that had fled from the burning plantation. Bell was ushered into it with a ceremonious suspicion. Almost immediately he was handcuffed to his seat. Two men took their place behind him. The big ship rolled forward, lifted, steadied, and after a single circling, set out to the southeast for Buenos Aires. The whole performance had been run off with the smoothly oiled precision of an iron discipline exercised upon men in the grip of deadly fear. One man, at least, reflected Bell grimly, has some qualities that fit him for his job. And then, for hour after hour, the big ship went steadily southeast. It flew over Paraguayan territory for 2 hours, soaring high over the Lago Ipoya, and on over the swampy country that extends to the Argentine border. It ignored that border and all customs formalities. It went on, through long hours of flight, while mountains rose before it. It rose over those mountains and passed over the first railroad line, the first real sign of civilization since leaving Asunción, at Mercedes, and reached the Uruguay River where the Maringe joins it. It went roaring on down above the valley of the Rio Uruguay for long and tedious hours more. At about noon, lunch was produced. The two men who guarded Bell ate. Then, with drawn revolvers, they unlocked his handcuffs and offered him food. He ate of exactly those foods he had seen them eat. He submitted indifferently to the reapplication of his fetters. He had reached a state which was curiously emotionless. If Paula had been turned over to Ribiera that morning, Paula was dead. And just as there is a state of grief which stuns the mind past the realization of its loss, so there is a condition of hatred which leads to an enormous calmness and an unnatural absence of any tremor. Bell had reached that state. The instinct of self-preservation had gone lax. Where a man normally thinks first, if unconsciously, of the protection of his body from injury or pain, Bell had come to think first, and with the same terrible clarity, of the accomplishment of revenge. He would accept the master's terms if the master offered him. He would become the master's subject, accepting the poison of madness without a qualm. He would act and speak and think as a subject of the master, until his opportunity came, and then his absolute calmness would have deceived most men. It may have deceived his guards. Time passed. The Rio de la Plata spread out widely below the roaring multi-engined plane, and the vast expanse of buildings which is Buenos Aires appeared far ahead in the gathering dust. Little twinkling lights blinked into being upon the water and the earth far away. Then one of the two guards touched Bell on the shoulder. "Senor," he said sharply above the motor's muffled roar. "We shall land. A car will draw up beside the plane. There will be no customs inspection. That has been arranged for. You can have no hope of escape. I ask if you will go quietly into the car." "Why not?" asked Bell evenly. "I went to Senor Francia of my own accord." The guard leaned back. The city of Buenos Aires spread out below them. The tumbled, congested old business quarter glittered in all its offices, and the broad Avenida de Mayo cut its way as a straight slash of glittering light through the section of the city to eastward. By contrast, from above, the far-flung suburbs seemed dark and somber. The big plane roared above the city, settling slowly, banked steeply, and circled upon its farther side, and dipped down toward what seemed an absurdly small area, which sprang into a pinkish glow on their descent. That area spread out as the descent continued, though, and was a wide and level field when the ship flattened out and checked and lumbered to a stop. A glistening black car came swiftly, humming into place alongside, almost before the clumsy aircraft ceased to roll. Its door opened. The two men got out and waited. The hangars were quite 200 yards away, and Bell saw the glitter of weapons held inconspicuously but quite ready. He stepped out of the cabin of the plane with a revolver muzzle pressing into his spine. Other revolver muzzles pressed sharply into his sides as he reached earth. Smiling faintly, he took 4 steps, clambered up into the glistening black car, and settled down comfortably into the seat. The two men who had waited by the car followed him. The door closed, and Bell was in a padded silence that was acutely uncomfortable for a moment. A dome light glowed brightly, however, and he lighted nearly the last of the cigarettes from Asunción, with every appearance of composure as the car started off with a lurch. The windows were blank. Thick upholstered padding covered the spaces where openings should have been, and there was only the muffled vibration of the motor and the occasional curiously distinct noise of a flexing spring. "Just a matter of curiosity," said Bell mildly. "What is the excuse given on the flying field for this performance? Or is the entire staff subject to the master?" 2 revolvers were bearing steadily upon him, and the 2 men watched him with the unwavering attention of men whose lives depend upon their vigilance. "You, senor," said one of them without expression or a smile, "are the corpse of a prominent politician who died yesterday at his country home." And then for half an hour or more the car drove swiftly and stopped, and drove swiftly forward again as if in traffic. Then there were many turns, and then a slow and cautious traverse of a relatively few feet. It stopped, and then the engine vibration ceased. "I advise you, senor," said the same man who had spoken before, and in the same emotionless voice, "not to have hope of escape in the moment of alighting. We are in an enclosed court, and there are 2 gates locked behind us." Bell shrugged as there was the clatter of a lock operating. The door swung wide. He stepped down into a courtyard surrounded by nearly bare walls. It had once been the patio of a private home of some charm. Now, however, it was bleak and empty. A few discouraged flowers grew weedily in one corner. The glow of light in the sky overhead assured Bell that he was in the very heart of Buenos Aires, but only the most subdued of rumbles spoke of the activity and the traffic of the city going on without. "This way," said the man with the expressionless voice. The other man followed. The chauffeur of the car stood aside as if some formality required him neither to start the motor or return to his seat until Bell was clear of the courtyard. Through a heavy timber door, along a passageway with the odor of neglect, upstairs which once had been impressive and ornamental, into a room without windows. You will have an interview with the Señorita Canalejas in 5 minutes, said the emotionless voice. The door closed, while Bell found every separate muscle in his body draw taut, and while his brain at first was dazed with incredulous relief, then it went dark with a new and ghastly terror. "They know Yahweh," he heard himself saying coldly, "which makes any person obey any command. They may know other and more hellish ones yet." He fought for self-control, which meant the ability to conceal absolutely any form of shock that might await him. That one was in store, he was certain. He paced grimly the length of the room and back again. Something on the carpet caught his eye. It was a bit of string. He stared at it incredulously. The end was tied into a curious and an individual knot, which looked like it might be the pastime of a sailor, and which looked like it ought to be fairly easy to tie. But it was one of those knots which wandering men sometimes tie absent-mindedly in the presence of stirring events. It was the recognition knot of the trade, one of those signs by which men may know each other in strange and peculiar situations. And there were many other knots tied along the trailing length of the string. It seemed as if some nervous and distraught prisoner in this room might have toyed abstractedly with a bit of cord. Only Bell drew it through his fingers, double knot, single knot, double knot. They spelled out letters in the entirely simple Morse code of the telegrapher, if one noticed. RBRAGNONPLAHREST Your old-time telegrapher uses many abbreviations. Your shortwave fan uses more. Mostly they were made by a simple omission of vowels in normal English. In normal English words. When the recognition sign at the beginning was considered, the apparently cryptic letters leaped into meaning. Ribiera gone on. Paula here, sit tight. Jameson. When the door opened again, and a terribly pale Paula was ushered in, Bell gave no sign of surprise. He simply took her in his arms and kissed her, holding her very, very close. End of chapter 13. End of section 21. Section 22 of Astounding Stories number 7, July 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Howell. Astounding Stories 7, July 1930, by Various. Murder Madness by Murray Leinster, Chapter 14. Chapter 14. Paula remained in the room with Bell for perhaps 20 minutes, and Bell had the feeling of eyes upon them and of ears listening to their every word. In their first embrace, in fact, he murmured a warning in her ear, and she gasped a little whispered word of comprehension. But it was at least a relief to be sure that she was alive and yet unharmed. Francia had been in error when he told Bell of Paula's delivery to the Brazilian to be enslaved or killed, as Ribiera found most amusing. Or perhaps, of course, Francia had merely wanted to cause Bell all possible discomfort. It was clear, however, blessedly clear and evident, that Paula's pallor was due to nothing more than terror. A terror which was now redoubled because Bell was in the master's toils with her. Forgetting his warning, she whispered to him desperately that he must try to escape, somehow before the master's poison was administered to him. Outside, he might do something to release her. Here, a prisoner, he was helpless. Bell soothed her, not daring either to confess the plan he had formed of a feigned submission in order to wreak revenge, or to offer encouragement because of the message knotted in the piece of string by Jameson. and because of that caution she came to look at him with a queer doubt, and presently with a terrible, quiet grief. "Charles, you have been poisoned like the rest?" The feeling of watching eyes and listening ears was strong. Bell had a part to play, and the necessity for playing that part was the greater because now he was forced to hope. He hesitated, torn between the need to play his role for the invisible eavesdroppers and the desire to spare Paula. Her hand closed convulsively upon his. "Very well, Charles," she said quietly, though her lips quivered. If you are going to serve the master, I will serve him too, if he will let me stay always near you. But if he will not, then I can always die." Bell groaned, and the door opened silently, and there were men standing without. An emotionless voice said, "Senorita, the Senor Ortiz will interview the Senor Bell." "I'm coming," said Paula quietly. She went, walking steadily. 2 men detached themselves from the group about the door and followed her. The others waited for Bell, and Bell clenched his hands and squared his shoulders and marched grimly with them. Again long passages, descending to what must have been a good deal below the surface of the earth, and then a massive door was opened, and light shone through, and Bell found himself standing on a rug of the thickest possible pile in a room of quite barbaric luxury, and facing a desk from which a young man was rising to greet him. This young man was no older than Bell himself, and he greeted Bell in a manner in which mockery was entirely absent, but in which defiance was peculiarly strong. A bulky, round-shouldered figure wrote laboriously at a smaller desk to one side. "Senor Bell," said the young man bitterly, "I do not ask you to shake hands with me. I am Julio Ortiz, the son of the man you befriended upon the steamer Almirante Gomez. I am also by the command of the master, your jailer. Will you be seated?" Bell's eyes flickered. The older Ortiz had died by his own hand in the first stages of the murder madness the master's poison produced. He had died gladly and, in Bell's view, very gallantly. And yet his son... But of course the master's deputies made a point of enslaving whole families when it was at all possible. It gave a stronger hold upon each member. "I beg of you," said young Ortiz bitterly, "to accept my invitation. I wish to offer you a much qualified friendship which I expect you to refuse." Bell sat down and crossed his knees. He lit a cigarette thoughtfully, thinking swiftly. "I remember and admired your father," he said slowly. "I think that any man who died as bravely as he did is to be envied." The younger Ortiz had reseated himself as Bell sat down, and now he fingered nervously, wretchedly, the objects on his desk. A penholder broke between his fingers, and he flung it irritably into the wastebasket. "You understand," he said harshly, "the obligations upon me. I am the subject of the master. You will realize that if you desire to escape, I cannot permit it. But you did my father a very great kindness. Much of it I was able to discover from persons on the boat. More from the wireless operator, who is also the subject of the master. You are not acting, Senor, as a Secret Service operative in your attempt to help my father. You bore yourself as a very honorable gentleman. I wish to thank you." "I imagine," said Bell dryly, "that anyone would have done what I did." He seemed to be quite at ease, but he was very tense indeed. The bulky, round-shouldered figure at the other desk was writing busily with a very scratchy pen. It was an abominable pen. Its sputtering was loud enough to be noticeable under any circumstances. But Bell was unusually alert just now, and suddenly he added still more dryly, "Helping a man in trouble is quite natural. One always gets it back. It's a sort of dealing with the future in which there is a profit on every trade." He put the slight emphasis on the last word and waited, looking at young Ortiz, but listening with all his soul to the scratching of the pen. and that scratching sound ceased abruptly. The pen seemed to write smoothly all of an instant. Bell drew a deep breath of satisfaction. In the trade, when in doubt, one should use the word trade in one's first remark to the other man. Then the other man will ask you your trade, and you reply impossibly. It is then up to the other man to speak frankly first. But circumstances alter even recognition signs. Ortiz had not noticed any byplay, of course. It would have been rather extraordinary if he had. A pen that scratches so that the sound is Morse code for Bell, play up, J, is just unlikely enough to avoid all notice. Ortiz drummed upon the desk. Now, senor, what can I do that will serve you? I cannot release you. You know that. I am not the deputy here. There has been a setback to the master's plans, and all the deputies are called to his retreat to receive instructions and to discuss. I have merely been ordered to carry out the deputy's routine labors until he returns. However, I will be obeyed in any matter. I can and will do anything that will make you more comfortable or will amuse you, from a change in your accommodations to providing you with companions. You observe, he added with exquisite bitterness, that the limit of my capacity to prove my friendship is to offer my services as a pander. Bell gazed at the tip of his cigarette, letting his eyes wander about the room for an instant, and permitting them to rest for the fraction of a second upon the round-shouldered, writing form by the side wall. I am sufficiently amused, he said mildly. I asked to be sent to the master. He intends to make me an offer, I understand, or he did. He may have changed his mind. But I am curious. Your father told me a certain thing that seemed to indicate he did not enjoy the service of the master. Your tone is quite loyal, but unhappy. Why do you serve him? Aside, of course, from the fact of having been poisoned by his deputy. Internally, Bell was damning Jameson feverishly. If he was to play up to Ortiz, why didn't Jameson give him some sign of how he was to do it, some tip? Herr Wiedkin, said Ortiz wearily, perhaps you can explain. The round-shouldered figure swung about and bowed profoundly to Bell. The Senor Ortiz, he said gutturally, and in a sepulchral profundity. He does not understand himself. I have never said it before, but he serves the master because he despairs, and he will cease to serve the master when he hopes. And I serve the master because I hope, and I will cease to serve him when I despair. Ortiz looked curiously and almost suspiciously at the Germanic figure, which regarded him soberly through thick spectacles. It is not customary, Herr Wiedkind, he said slowly, to speak of ceasing to serve the master. It is not customary to speak of many necessary things, said the round-shouldered figure dryly. Of our religions, for example, of the women we love, of our consciences, of various necessary biological functions, but in the presence of the young man who is the enemy of the master, we can speak freely, you and I who serve him. We know that maybe the deputies serve because they enjoy it, but their subjects, they serve because they fear. And fear is intolerable. A man who is afraid is in an unstable condition. Sooner or later he is going to stop fearing because he gets used to it, when the master will have no more hold on him, or else he is going to stop fearing because he will kill himself. To an outsider, the spectacle of the three men and their talk would have been very odd indeed. Two men who served the master, and one who had been his only annoying opponent, talking of the service of the master quite amicably and without marked disagreement. Ortiz stirred and drummed nervously on the desk. The round-shouldered figure put the tips of his fingers together. How did you know, demanded Ortiz suddenly, that I serve because I despair? Bell watched keenly. He began to see where the talk was trending, and waited alertly for the moment for him to speak. This was a battlefield. This too luxurious room in which young Ortiz seemed an alien. Rhetoric was the weapon which now would serve the best. "Let us talk frankly," said the placid German voice. "You and I, Senor Ortiz, have worked together. You are not a deputy like most of the deputies, and I do not regret having been sent here to help you. And I am not a scoundrel like most of those who help the deputies, so you have liked me a little. Let us talk frankly. I was trapped. I am a capable secretary. I speak several languages. I have no particular ambitions or any loyalties. I am useful, so I was trapped. But you, Senor Ortiz, you are different." Ortiz suddenly smiled bitterly. "It is as a saying in Brazil. If I recall the words, a caro do demonio y de rendas. The devil's tail is made of lace. That is the story." Bell said quietly, "No." Ortiz stared at him. He was very pale, and suddenly he laughed without any amusement whatever. "True," said Ortiz. He smiled in the same bitterness. "I had forgotten. I am a slave, and Herr Wiedkin is a slave, and you, Senor Bell, are the enemy of our master. But I had forgotten that we are gentlemen. In the service of the master, one does not forget that there are gentlemen." He laughed again and lighted a cigarette with hands that shook a little. "I loved a girl," he said in cynical amusement. "It is peculiar that one should love any woman, senores. Or do you, Senor Bell, find it natural? I loved this girl. It pleased my father. She was of a family fully equal to my own. Their wealth, their position, their traditions were quite equal, and it was a most suitable match. Most remarkable of all, I loved her as one commonly loves only when no such considerations exist. It is amusing to me now to think how deeply and how truly and how terribly I loved her." Young Ortiz's pallor deepened as he smiled at them. His eyes, so dark as to be almost black, looked at them from a smiling mask of whiteness. "There was no flaw anywhere. A romance of the most romantic. My father very happy. Her family most satisfied and pleased. And I walked upon air. And then my father suddenly departed for the United States quite without warning. He left a memorandum for me saying that it was a matter of government, a secret matter. He would explain upon his return. I did not worry. I haunted the house of my fiancée. The habits of her family are of the most liberal. I saw her daily, almost hourly, and my infatuation grew. And suddenly I grew irritable and saw red spots before my eyes. Her father took me to task about my nervousness. He led me kindly to a man of high position, who poured out for me a little potion. And within an hour all my terrible unease had vanished. And then they told me of the master, of the poison I had been given in the house of my fiancée herself. They informed me that if I served the master, I would be provided with the antidote which would keep me sane. I raged, and then the father of my fiancée told me that he and all his family served the master, that the girl I loved herself owed him allegiance, and while I would possibly have defied them and death itself, the thought of that girl not daring to wed me because of the poison in her veins, I saw then that she was in terror. I imagined the two of us comforting each other beneath the shadow of the most horrible of fates." Ortiz was silent for what seemed to be a long time, smiling mirthlessly at nothing. When his lips parted, it was to laugh, a horribly discordant laughter. "I agreed," he said in ghastly amusement, "for the sake of my loved one. I agreed to serve the master that I might comfort her. And plans for our wedding, which had been often and inexplicably delayed, were set in train at once. And the deputy of the master entertained me often. I plied him with drink, striving to learn all that I could, hoping against hope that there would be some way of befooling him and securing the antidote without the poison. And at last, when very drunken, he laughed at me for my intention of marriage. He advised me tipsily to serve the master zealously and receive promotion in his service. Then he told me amusedly I would not care for marriage. My fiancée would be at my disposal without such formalities. In fact, while I stood rigid with horror, he sent a command for her to attend him immediately. He commanded me to go to an apartment in his dwelling, and soon, within minutes, it seemed, the girl I loved came there to see me. Bell did not move. There was no moment to interrupt. Ortiz's fixed and cynical smile wavered and vanished. His voice was harsh. She was at my disposal as an act of drunken friendship by the deputy of the master. She confessed to me, weeping, that she had been at the disposal of the deputy himself, of any other person he cared to divert or amuse. Oh, Dios! Ortiz stopped short and said, with forced calmness, "That was also the night that my father died." Silence fell. Bell sat very still. The Teutonic figure spoke quietly after the clock had ticked for what seemed an interminable period. "You did know, then, that your father's death was arranged?" Ortiz turned stiffly to look at him. "Here," said the placid voice, quaintly sympathetic. "Look at this." A hand extending a thick envelope. Ortiz took it, staring with wide, distended eyes. The round-shouldered figure stood up and seemed to shake itself. The stoop of its shoulders straightened out. One of the seemingly pudgy hands reached up and removed the thick spectacles. A bushy gray eyebrow peeled off. A straggly beard was removed. The other eyebrow. Jameson nodded briefly to Bell and turned to watch Ortiz. And Ortiz was reading the contents of the envelope. His hands began to shake violently. He rested them on the desktop so that he could continue to read. When he looked up, his eyes were flaming. "The real Herr Wiedekind," said Jameson dryly, "came up from Punta Arenas with special instructions from the master. You have talents, Senor Ortiz, which the master wished to use. Also, you have considerable wealth and the prestige of an honorable family. But you were afflicted with ideas of honor and decency which are disadvantageous in deputies of the master. The real Herr Wiedekind had remarkable gifts in eradicating those ideas." Jameson sat down and crossed his knees carefully. "I looked you up because I knew the master had killed your father," he added mildly. "And I thought you'd either be hunting the master or he'd be hunting you. My name's Jameson. I killed the real Wiedekind and took his identification papers. He was a singularly unpleasant beast. His idea of pleasure made him seem a fatherly sort of person, very much like my makeup. He was constantly petting children and appeared very benign. I am very, very glad that I killed him." Ortiz tore at his collar suddenly. He seemed to be choking. This says it is the master's handwriting. I know it, and it says..." "It says," Jameson observed calmly, "that since your father killed the previous deputy in an attempt to save you from the master's poison, that you are to be prepared for the work your father had been assigned. Herr Wiedekind is given special orders about your, moral education. In passing, I might say that your father was sent to the United States because it was known he'd killed the previous deputy. He told Bell he'd done that killing, and he was allowed to grow horribly nervous on his return. He was permitted to see the red spots because he was officially, even as far as you were concerned, to commit suicide."
It was intended that his nervousness was to be noticed, and a plane tried to deliver a message to him. Your father thought the parcel containing the antidote to the poison that was driving him mad. Actually, it was a very conventional prussic acid. Your father would have drunk it and dropped dead, a suicide, after a conspicuous period of nervousness and worry.
Bell felt his cigarette burning his fingers. He had sat rigid until the thing burned short. He crushed out the coal, looking at Ortiz. And Ortiz seemed to gasp for breath. But with an almost superhuman effort, he calmed himself outwardly.
I think, he said with some difficulty, that I should thank you. I do. But I do not think that you told me all of this without some motive. I abandoned the service of the master. But what is it that you wish me to do? You know, of course, that I can order both of you killed.
Bell put down the stub of his cigarette very carefully. The only thing you can do, he said quietly, is to die.
True, said Ortiz with a ghastly smile. But I would like my death to perform some service. The master has no enemies save you two, and those of us who die on becoming his enemies. I would like, in dying, to do him some harm. I will promise, said Jameson grimly, to see that the master dies himself if you will have Bell and myself put in a plane with fuel to Punta Arenas and a reasonable supply of weapons. I include the Señorita Canalejas as a matter of course.
Ortiz looked from one to the other, and suddenly he smiled once more. It was queer, that smile. It was not quite mirthless.
You were right just now, he observed calmly. When as the Herr Wiedkind, you said that I would quit the service of the master when I ceased to despair. I begin to have hopes. You two men have done the impossible. You have fought the master. You have learned many of his secrets. And you have corrupted a man to treason when treason means suicide. Perhaps, senores, you will continue to achieve the impossible and assassinate the master.
He stood up, and though deathly pale, continued to smile.
I suggest, senor, that you resume your complexion. And you, Senor Bell, you will be returned to your confinement. I will make the necessarily elaborate arrangements for my death.
Bell rose. He liked this young man. He said quietly, You said just now that you wouldn't ask me to shake hands. May I ask you? He added almost apologetically as Ortiz's fingers closed upon his. You see, when your father died, I thought that I would be very glad if I felt that I would die as well. But I think, he smiled wryly, I think I'll have two examples to think of when my time comes. In the morning, a bulky, round-shouldered figure entered the room in which Bell was confined.
You will follow me, said a harsh voice.
Bell shrugged. He was marched down long passageways and many steps. He came out into the courtyard where the glistening black car with the blank windows waited. At an imperious gesture, he got in and sat down with every appearance of composure, as of a man resignedly submitting to force he cannot resist. The thick spectacles of the Herr Wiedkind regarded him with a goggle-like effect. There was a long pause. Then the sound of footsteps. Paula appeared deathly pale. She was ushered into the vehicle, and only Bell's swift gesture of a finger to his lips checked her cry of relief. Voices outside. The guttural Spanish of the Herr Wiedkind. Other emotionless voices replying. The Herr Wiedkind climbed heavily into the car and sat down, producing a huge revolver which bore steadily upon Bell. The door closed, and he made a swift gesture of caution.
"It may be," said the Germanic voice harshly, "that you and the young lady have much to say to each other, but it can wait. And I warn you, mein Herr, that at the first movement I shall fire."
Bell relaxed. There was the purring of the motor. The car moved off. Obviously, there was some microphonic attachment inside the tonneau which carried every word within the locked vehicle to the ears of the two men upon the chauffeur's seat. An excellent idea for protection against treachery. Bell smiled and moved so that his lips were a bare half-inch from Paula's ears. "Try to weep loudly," he said in the faintest of whispers. "This man is a friend." But Paula could only stare at the bulky figure sitting opposite until he suddenly removed the spectacles and smiled dryly, and then reached in his pockets and handed Bell 2 automatic pistols, and extended a tiny but very wicked weapon to Paula. He motioned to her to conceal it. Jameson, moving to make the minimum of noise, handed Bell a sheet of stiff cardboard. It passed into Bell's fingers without a rustle. He showed it silently to Paula. "We were overheard last night by someone. We don't know who or how much he heard. Dictaphone in the room we talked in. Can't find out who it was or what action he's taken. We may be riding into a trap now. Ortiz has disappeared. He may be dead. We can only wait and see." The car was moving as if in city traffic. A swift dash forward and a sudden stop. And then another swift dash. But the walls within were padded so that no sound came from without save the faint vibration of the motor, and now and then the distinct flexing of a spring. Then the car turned a corner. It went more rapidly. It turned another corner. And another. In the light of the bright dome light, Bell saw beads of sweat coming out on Jameson's face. He did not dare to speak, but he formed words with his lips. "He's turning wrong. This isn't the way to the field." Bell's jaws clenched. He took out his 2 automatics and looked at them carefully. And then, much too short a time from the departure for the flying field to have been reached, the car checked. It went over rough cobblestones, and Bell himself knew well that there had been no cobbled roadway between the flying field and his prison. And then the car went up a sort of ramp, a fairly steep incline, which by the feel of the motor was taken in low and on for a short distance more. Then the car stopped, and the motor was cut off. Keys rattled in the lock outside. The door opened. The blunt barrel of an automatic pistol peered in. To be concluded in the next issue. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Astounding Stories 7, July 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 7, July 1930, by Various. The Reader's Corner. A meeting place for readers of Astounding Stories. About reprints. From time to time the editors of Astounding Stories receive letters, like the 2 that follow, in which readers beg us to run reprints, and now we feel it's time to call attention to the very good reasons why we must refuse. We admit right off that some splendid science fiction stories have been published in the past, but are those now being printed in any way inferior to them? Aren't even better ones being written today? Since a whole civilization now stirs with active interest in science, since 3 or 5 times as many writers are now supplying us with stories to choose from, since science and scientific theory have reached so immeasurably much farther into the realm of the unknown possible? The answer is an emphatic yes. We all know it. A Trip to the Moon, for instance, was a good story, but shall we keep reprinting it today, when recent revolutionary theories of space-time scream to modern authors for science fiction treatment. In the last 10 years the whole aspect, the whole future of science has broadened. We have sensed an infinity beyond infinity. And who would be so unmodern as to cling to the oft-told stories of the older science, and neglect the thrilling riches of the new? The Saturday Evening Post, again for instance, has been publishing good stories for years. But who would have them reprint the old ones instead of giving us good new ones? Would it be fair to 99% of our readers to force on them reprint novels they have already read, or had a chance to read, to favor the 1% who have missed them? Of course it wouldn't, and all of our readers in that 1% will gladly admit it. And how about our authors? Contrary to the old-fashioned opinion, authors must eat, and how will they eat and lead respectable lives, and keep out of jail, if we keep reprinting their old stories and turning down their new ones? After all, eating is very important. Those who wouldn't simply refrain from eating would have to get jobs as messengers, and errand boys, etc., with the result that much of our fascinating modern science fiction would never be written. It would be much cheaper for us to buy once used material. It would greatly reduce our task of carefully reading every story that comes to our office, in hopes to find a fine new story, or a potentially good author. But it would be very unwise and very unfair, as you have seen. Many more reasons could be given, but these few are the more important ones back of our policy of avoiding reprints. Enough said. The Editor. Once reprints. Dear Editor, in your April issue, in answer to a correspondent, you stated that you were avoiding reprints. Now, that's too bad. Some of the best science fiction tales are reprints. Witness: The Blind Spot, by Homer Eon Flint and Austin Hall; The War in the Air, by H. G. Wells; The Purple Sapphire, by John Taine; The Conquest of Mars, by Garrett P. Serviss; Darkness and Dawn, and Into the Great Oblivion, and The Afterglow, and The Air Trust, all by George Allen England. You are proud, and rightfully so, of your great author, Ray Cummings. Why not give us several stories which helped to build his glory? Here are several: Taranta the Conqueror, The Man on the Meteor, The Girl in the Golden Atom, The Man Who Mastered Time, The Fire People. Guess I'll sign off now, and give the other fellows a chance. Isidore Mannion, 544 Myrtle Avenue, Brooklyn, New York. What think you all? Dear Editor, there is one question I would like to ask. Perhaps some of the other readers of Astounding Stories can answer it. Could a person remember his own death in a former incarnation? Some say no, and some say yes. If it's true that you can't, the whole fabric of the wonderful story, one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful I have ever read, The Moon Maid by Edgar Rice Burroughs, is built on a fallacy. You see, I am a believer in reincarnation, and I would surely like to correspond with others who are also. Wouldn't that also disprove the whole theory of reincarnation if it's true? I think it's not true, but I may be wrong. Is reincarnation a proven theory or unproven? You say you are going to avoid reprints. Now that is a mistake. Of course, some you might avoid, such as those of Wells, Verne, etc., though I would like you to publish Wells' short stories. There are many that haven't been published in any magazine for a long time, or at all. But please, oh please, do publish A. Merritt's Through the Dragon Glass, and give it a cover illustration. It's the only one, I think, that I want particularly, but I do want it. If you publish any of H. G. Wells' works, give them cover illustrations too. And publish a lot by Merritt, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and authors like that. You haven't as yet printed a story of the type that A. Merritt writes, and that is one thing this magazine needs, and lots of them, as they are the cream of science fiction, and the more of them you have, the better. They are my favorites, and next come those that Edgar Rice Burroughs writes, also John Taine. Worth K. Bryant, 406 North 3rd Street, Yakima, Washington. The S. Lynn Rohrer Society. Dear Editor, this is to inform you that we have organized a society known as the S. Lynn Rohrer Society of Great Atlanta, a branch of the Science Correspondence Club. This society's purpose is to first assist the Science Correspondence Club and its affiliated branches in the promotion of science and scientific fiction. Second, to create a greater interest in science and science fiction among the laymen who are already interested, and to create an interest among those who are not at the present interested and to hold their interest. At the present time we have in our library over 300 scientific books, a large collection of ores and rocks from different states and countries, classified, a large collection of fossilized bones, a 3-inch refracting telescope, and a 10-inch one in the course of construction, and a large clubhouse. Any information regarding this society can be obtained by addressing R. A. Marks, Jr., 893 York Avenue, S.W., Atlanta, Georgia, or the undersigned, F. B. Eason, 400 Jefferson Avenue, E. Point, Georgia. Unused to the smaller size. Dear Editor, I have but one comment on your magazine, and that is: having complete sets of other science fiction magazines, I would also like to save Astounding Stories, but in its present size and condition, it looks like trash. Why not have a ballot to what size the magazine shall be? By having the price raised to 25 cents, it can cover the extra expense. I would surely like to add another magazine to my collection. Am hereby hoping you will do this for the sake of science fiction lovers all over the country. Sidney Mack, 1676, 59th Street, Brooklyn, New York. The Scienceers Broadcasts. Dear Editor, for the benefit of the readers of Astounding Stories who live in New York, a club known as the Scienceers has recently been formed. Its purpose is to promote informal fellowship among science fiction fans and to foster discussion of modern developments, theories, and projects in the realm of science. The organization is open to all persons over 16 years of age who are interested in science fiction and its relation to the various fields of present-day science. Since regular weekly meetings are held, the membership is necessarily restricted to residents of New York City and vicinity. A cordial invitation to join the Scienceers is hereby extended to all interested. Further information may be obtained by writing to the undersigned. Alan Glasser, 961 Forest Avenue, New York, New York. Congratulations for both. Dear Editor, congratulations for us both, your company for publishing this magazine, myself for being able to buy same. Have just finished reading the second issue. It's very good. I read every story in both issues. You bet I am going to be a steady reader from now on. I like this type of story very much. In fact, I read 2 other magazines that publish stories of this type every month. I note with great pleasure that in the March issue you are starting to publish the first quarter of an interplanetary story by Ray Cummings. This is indeed good news. I have had the pleasure of reading 5 of his novels this past year, and I greatly enjoyed all of them. Along with Edgar Rice Burroughs, Ray Cummings is an ace-high author on these unpredictable future stories. Some 4 or 5 years ago, I read in a magazine a portion of 2 interplanetary stories by Ray Cummings. Now to the point. I wonder if it's possible for you to obtain Mr. Cummings' permission to have your company publish these 2 stories. Their names, I believe, are Terento the Conqueror and Into the Fourth Dimension. I, for one, would greatly appreciate this favor. Please do your best to try and publish these novels this coming year. Thanks. William L. Eberlin, 3906 Springdale Avenue, Baltimore, Maryland. Likes the small size. Dear Editor, I received a pleasant surprise when I first bought your wonderful magazine. I started in with the 2nd issue, but I wish I could get the 1st. All the stories are good. The best of them, I think, is Ray Cummings' story, Brigands of the Moon. I have read the first 3 parts and am eagerly waiting for the last. And now for something about the makeup of the magazine. I like the small size, and holding the magazine together with 2 staples is good. The cover designs are very good, but the pictures inside could be improved on. H. Wesser is a good artist. How about publishing the magazine twice a month? Charles Barrett, 135 Spring Street, Woodbury, New Jersey. Thanks, anyhow. Dear Editor, I hope that you are not going to have a blue cover every month. I would like to see a different colored background every month. The cover on the March issue should have been black because space is black. I wish that you would have a full-page picture for each story. Wesley is the best artist you have. The others haven't enough imagination. I gave Brigands of the Moon by Ray Cummings first place in the March issue of Astounding Stories. It promises to be his best story since Terento the Conqueror. The places of other stories are as follows: 2nd, Vandals of the Stars; 3rd, The Soul Master; 4th, Cold Light; 5th, From the Ocean's Depths. If you would enlarge Astounding Stories to 11 3/4 by 8 1/2, it would be seen more easily on the newsstands, and its circulation would increase. Please publish it on the 1st of the month instead of the 1st Thursday. Jack Darrow, 4225 North Spalding Avenue, Chicago, Illinois. All readers are extended a sincere and cordial invitation to come over in the Reader's Corner and join in our monthly discussion of stories, authors, scientific principles, and possibilities. Everything that's of common interest in connection with our Astounding Stories. Although from time to time the editor may make a comment or so, this is a department primarily for readers, and we want you to make full use of it. Likes, dislikes, criticism, explanations, roses, brickbats, suggestions, everything's welcome here. So come over in the Reader's Corner and discuss it with all of us. The Editor. End of section 23. End of Astounding Stories 7, July 1930, by Various.